Okay guys, welcome to the Storyteller, and this is the last story that we would normally be looking at, and it's an interesting story, and I chose it because it is about a storyteller, which is an interesting concept, and two, like the Aladdin story, this is a frame story, a story within a story. The difference between the storyteller and the Aladdin story is that in the storyteller, you know that the story it's a story within a story, and you read that. So, uh, and that we'll find out more about that once we get more into the story. And this shows the enchanting nature of a good storyteller and a good story. And guys, as we kind of look at this story, guys, think about this one question. Who is the main character? And I figure, guys, that when you get to the end of the story, I will bet that maybe 50% of you are going to say one particular character. But, guys, I think I may challenge you on who the main character really is. So let's take a look at the PDF here once it loads. Okay. And the storyteller starts off, it's an English story. SAKI is an English writer, and it's a hot afternoon, and this story was written before the age of cars, and they're in a I believe it's either a carriage. I believe it's a carriage they're in. Yes, occupants of a carriage here. And there's a bachelor, and there is an aunt who has some young kids with her, who are her nieces. I think it's two nieces and a nephew. And you might say, guys, that the initial conflict in this story, guys, is the fact that the aunt is having a hard time dealing with, and we might even say controlling, or maybe better, managing her nieces and nephew. Because there's always this thing about where the nieces and nephew are doing things, and the aunt's response is, don't do this, don't do that, right? And the kids often respond to, why bother with this, right? And the bachelor just sits back and he's very quiet about this thing. And so the story goes on, guys, with one of the kids talks about a scene outside of their window. There's cows, there's grass, and there's always that thing about the grass is always greener on the other side. And the aunt talks about that. The kids talk about that. Why is it better? And they're always asking the question about why this, why that, right? And the aunt then, later on in the story, I believe it's right here on the second page here, in which the aunt starts to tell a story. And the kids here figure that her ability to be a storyteller is not really all that good. And so it says here, in a low, confidential voice, interrupted at frequent intervals by loud, petulant questionings, she began an unenterprising and deplorably uninteresting story about a little girl who was good and made friends with everyone on account of her goodness, and was finally saved from a mad bull by a number of rescuers who admired her moral character. And of course, guys, with this, the kids they ask about what made her good, why was she good, yada yada yada, right there. And there's all these questions about this and about that. The kids don't like the story. It says here, I did listen after the first bit. It was so stupid, right? And that's what the boy says there. And the kids are just really giving her a hard time about this, really giving her a critique about her story, and not really enjoying it. And that's when the bachelor jumps into the story here, and he says, "You don't seem to be a success as a storyteller." And he says this suddenly from his corner there. And what does the aunt do? She bristled. I can just see her giving that little sneer, that sneer of disapproval to the bachelor, and you can almost hear this unspoken comment, "Why are you listening?" That sort of thing, right? And of course, the aunt says it's difficult to tell good stories, and that kids can understand and appreciate. The bachelor disagrees, and this is the challenge. Perhaps you would like to tell them a story. And that, guys, is the beginnings here. And the beginning, shall I say, of another part of this story. And the girls say, "Tell us a story here." And what is interesting, guys, is that when I was talking about what the ant's story, the narrator tells us that story in a very small paragraph, right? Because if we go back up here, guys, there is the, let me find it again here. Yeah, right here. This is all we know about the ant's story. That's all we know about it. And so this time, guys, we're going to hear a story within the story. And of course, guys, once upon a time, I mean, gee whiz, guys, how many times have we heard that, right? Now, there's a bit of a difference here, guys. Here we have, there was a little girl called Bertha. And it's interesting, guys, that we immediately know the name of the character here. The name of this character within the story. Her name is Bertha. So we already know a detail about this micro story here. And she was extraordinarily good, right? And notice how this story is in, at least right now, is kind of a parallel story to what the aunt told. And so, guys, the children's momentarily aroused interest began at once to flicker. All stories seemed dreadfully alike, no matter who told them. She did all that she was told, the bachelor says. She was always thankful, and she kept her clothes clean. She ate milk puddings as though they were jam tarts. Remember, this is England, okay? She learned her lessons perfectly and was polite in her manners. And notice now, guys, that the kids are saying, "Was she pretty?" And notice how, guys, that these kids are then beginning to kind of be involved in the story. They're asking questions. This is that magic word, interaction. And notice how that the bachelor then responds. "Not as pretty as any of you, but she was horribly good." And notice the contrast of that, the almost, you might say, even the oxymoron here. Horribly good, guys? Gee whiz. And there was a wave of reaction in favor of this story because of that word horrible in connection with goodness. Because you have that irony bit there, right? You wouldn't expect anybody to be horribly good, but they are. And so the thing is, this story then begins to progress. She wins, she has won several medals, and she pins these things to her dress. And that will come into play a bit later on in the story, guys. And she had all these medals. They were clinging on her dress. Everybody made a big deal about them, right? And so there is a prince in this country where she lives, where Bertha lives. And so the prince has this magic garden, this park as it says here, and no children were allowed to be there. However, the prince invites her into the park because she is so good. And notice here too, guys, notice how still the kids are responding to this thing. Are there any sheep in the park? And that's when the bachelor then says no, there weren't any sheep. And that's when the bachelor seems to take whatever the kids say about this and add, in a sense, he's ad-libbing with this. He's ad-libbing with it. But he always adds things to the story because he's interacting with the kids. The bachelor is a good storyteller here. And here, there's all kinds of things going on here, all kinds of weird things. There's sheep, there are pigs. I believe there are, I'm not sure if there's flowers or not, but I think the flowers may have something to do with the pigs. But he describes the pigs, he describes all the things in the that are in this park. And then I'm going to be skipping a little bit here, guys, because there's things here about because Bertha walked up and down, enjoyed herself immensely, and thought to herself, if I were not so good, I would not be here. And her metals clinged against one another. And remember that. The metals clinged up against each other. And so here, there is, she actually comes across a wolf, an enormous wolf. And what color is it? He's mud color all over, the black tongue, the pale gray eyes. And this is when the wolf enters and adds to the conflict in the story. Because Bertha saw the wolf and saw that it was stealing towards her. In other words, coming at her. And she began to wish, I wish I hadn't been here, right? It meant she got into a shrubbery of myrtle bushes. And then that's when the wolf begins to sniff around and sniffs her, and it begins to sniff her on the wind and things like that. So, and then, guys, I want to kind of summarize the end here, guys, in that as the wolf really begins to get really close to her, she's in the bushes, and thing is, that's when her metals begin to cling. That's when her metals, they begin to cling, and that's what alerts the wolf that somebody is in there. And so, what happens? He dashed into the bush, and he dragged Bertha out and devoured her to the last morsel. You might even say, guys, end of the story, right? And that's when the kids start asking more questions about this, about the pigs get killed. No, they all escaped. And that's when the kids say, hey, the story began badly, but it had a beautiful ending. Now think about that, guys. Think about that. You have a story that has a beautiful ending, and it ends with Bertha, who is this character here, who's killed? Really? Get real, guys. Beautiful ending. Someone dies at the end. It's a beautiful ending. Okay. And that's when one of the other kids says, it is the most beautiful story that I have ever heard, right? And another kid reiterates that. And there's the aunt says, it was a terrible story, right? A most improper story to tell young children. You have undermined the effect of years of careful teaching. Dramatic pause here, guys. At any rate, the bachelor said, collecting his belongings, before he leaves. And he says, I kept them quiet for 10 minutes, which was more than you were able to do. It's like, in your eye, Aunt, in your eye, right? Yeah. And then the woman says, that's when the bachelor says as he gets off, unhappy woman. It says, for the next 6 months or so, those children will assail her in public with demands for an improper story. And that, guys, is kind of an interesting ending to the story. Now remember, guys, this is a story within a story. And the story about Bertha is the story within the story. The overall story begins at the very beginning and ends right here. Okay? Now, guys, here is the rhetorical question. Who is the main character?